Tokyo Bay, 1st of September 1945. The tide licked the creosote pilings beneath a Maury like a dog at an empty bowl, and Sergeant John Red Hanlon cupped his hands around a tin of rice gruel alive with weevils. He would have flicked them away once. Now he watched them paddle like pepper flakes and counted the calories with a bookkeeper's calm. The guards were as thin as fence slats. A corporal's boots had split at the toe. Burlap twine held them together. It was the same every morning. Mildew, salt rot, the sweet metal smell of rust, a spoonful of heat that did nothing for the ache under Red's ribs. He told himself to save 3 grains for later. Superstition had become a strategy. Engines murmured beyond the warehouses, one vibration, then many, a change in pressure he felt in his teeth. He shaded his eyes. High and pale, like popped seed in a blue skillet, parachutes opened over the bay. The yard went still. Even the crows sounded shocked. A crate hit, skidded, and spun. A crowbar squealed, a lid jumped, tins rolled bright as coins. Fat, salt, life. A medic barked something cheerful in a voice that had not learned how to be quiet. Red smelled beef before he saw it, a ghost of Sunday in Pennsylvania, rendered tallow, pepper, boiled potatoes. A young Japanese guard stared as if watching a magic trick, shame and hunger fighting behind his face. Red's hands shook as he lifted the first spoonful. He knew the rule about refeeding, had heard the doctors. Small bites, slow. He let the stew sit on his tongue until it burned, and thought of January's dry moon over Luzon, men in socks gliding through cane stubble, a ranger with an 8-round M1 Garand, and a prize hidden in his pack, hardtack and a can of meat, the only words that mattered then. The medic pressed a chocolate bar into Red's palm and grinned like a boy learning Christmas was real. Somewhere out over the water, another crate thumped down. He looked at the guard again. The boy still hadn't moved. Red recognized the hollow wobble in the knees, the way the belt had chewed a notch deeper into the waist. Hunger spoke an international language. Red tipped his spoon the slightest degree toward the fence line, a truce offered without ceremony. The guard blinked and swallowed. Engines faded, but the smell stayed. A promise. On the far side of the yard, a chaplain raised his eyes into the bright silence and whispered a calendar entry he could barely believe. This was how wars ended now, with food falling from bomb bays. Red took another slow bite and thought, as the heat eased down his throat, that something larger than mercy had turned in the sky. Kansas, 1944. The chalkboard in the mess read beef stew, bread, coffee, fruit in block letters, and CPL Rose Martinez tapped a stem thermometer against the pot until the mercury settled. Steam ghosted her glasses. She signed a requisition with grease on her knuckles, while refrigerated trucks hissed at the loading dock like tired snakes. Inspection was due at 0900, and the Quartermaster Corps loved its scales and ledgers more than any general loved his map. The rule was simple and exacting. Enemy prisoners of war received rations equal to those of US troops at base camps. Not similar, equal, meat daily, coffee real, sugar measured, not imagined. The German prisoners in line glanced at the chalkboard with the wary gratitude of men who understood systems. Some muttered that American stew tasted of pepper and patience. One tried out a phrase, "Danke, miss," and Rose smiled without losing cadence. She had learned to ladle with a quartermaster's precision, 8 ounces per bowl, plus bread, plus fruit. Waste was logged, leftovers charted. Trains came on time. Ice plants fed the cold chain. She could trace a slab of beef from the slaughterhouse through the depot and into her kettle with an index finger and 3 punch cards. At night she read menu circulars like romances: meat, bread, vegetables, fruit, coffee, sugar, the quartermaster's liturgy. A captain arrived with a clipboard and a raised eyebrow. "Corporal, you feed 'em like this every day?" Rose nodded. "Regulations, sir." He frowned at the chalkboard, at the stew, at the German who said, "Sir," like it tasted odd. "They eat better than I did in basic," Rose shrugged. "Then the system's doing what it's supposed to." The captain signed and left. The kettle burped. She thought of brothers on destroyers and cousins in the 1st Cavalry Division and felt the quiet interlock of things, rails, depots, timetables, click into place. She knew nothing of Tokyo Bay, only that somewhere far away a problem was being solved with airplanes and arithmetic. Her job, proof that law could be logistics, was smaller and just as stubborn. She checked the thermometer again, whistled her 2-note signal, and watched the line move like a river. Tray, bread, stew, fruit, coffee, thank you, next. She kept a can label in her journal, pasted it flat with flour paste, a souvenir of abundance. The band from town practiced outside the wire, brass bright in the noon. Rose wiped the chalkboard clean and wrote tomorrow's menu in letters as big as a headline. Meat. She underlined it once. In the cool, diesel-scented shadow of the loading dock, a new truck door slammed like a promise delivered on schedule. Luzon, 30 January 1945, an hour before moonset. Heat stored in the cane fields bled upward in a slow, invisible tide, and the 6th Ranger Battalion moved in socks so the stubble wouldn't talk. Alamo Scouts went first, Filipino guerrillas flowing at the edges, the kind of local knowledge you only earn by bleeding for it. The plan was a metronome, distances paced, sentries mapped, wire counted. The 1st Ranger carried an M1 Garand with an 8-round N-block clip and tucked deep in his pack a promise in tin, meat and hardtack. In the dark he could smell the river and the dry grass and the nervous metal of his own sweat on the sling. The huts of Cabanatuan held men who were shadows of their enlistment papers. When the 1st guard fell and the 2nd didn't cry out, time sped up. A gate that would have groaned seemed to inhale and open. A ranger hissed, "Move! Move!" in the voice of a guy who'd done this in rehearsal and now, finally, wouldn't have to rehearse again. The first prisoner they reached took the can before the canteen, cradled it and turned away to cry where no one could watch. Someone said, "God bless," and someone else said nothing at all. The extraction began to grind, the way extractions do, with litters bumping over ruts, a mule cart that wouldn't cooperate, a watch that ran too fast. Guerrillas raised a dust screen where the road bent. A machine gun on a pickup sang its angry lullaby. Across the fields, a star shell flicked once and died, no alarm. The Rangers reseated their socks inside their boots, shoulders lowering half an inch when leather met heel. Weight went onto the road, American on one side, American on the other, Ghost in the middle. They would cover 30 miles by dawn. They would count heads, roughly 513 lives, each its own ledger, and keep moving. A ranger would stuff the empty tin back into his pack as if it were shield and talisman. In the interim, courage was a simple exchange, one man's risk traded for another's breath. The smell of that meat, salt and fat and something like home, stayed longer than the burst of fire. Impossible as it sounded to the emaciated men, this rescue was an appetizer. In the months ahead, another machine would pinch the islands at the throat, not with bullets but with absence, and turn whole harbours into waiting rooms where nothing arrived. The Rangers, sock-footed and grim, could not see it. But they were marching toward its proof, step after step, breath after breath, tin rattling softly in a pack that felt suddenly not heavy at all. Guam, 27th March, 1945. The briefing room smelled of pencil shavings and hot cloth. First Lieutenant Harold Mac McGovern stood over a map where the blue of Japan's coasts had been punctured by green pins, Shimonoseki Strait, Tokyo Bay, Kobe, Nagoya. The operations officer tapped a pointer and spoke in a flat voice that made the plan sound like weather. Tonight, the B-29 superfortresses would not haul incendiaries. They would lay mines, quiet, patient, vicious as arithmetic. Approach at specified altitude and speed, release at timed intervals, ride the radio altimeter and the shoreline radar return like a guide rope. The bomb bay doors would open on absence. Mac liked numbers more than speeches. 4 Wright R3350 engines, roughly 2,200 horsepower each. A cruising speed that made the Pacific small, a range that let you draw lines across a globe as if it were a notepad. He scratched corrections on his kneeboard. The mine types had names that sounded like nicknames, different triggers and delay fuses tuned to hull shape and harbour habit. You didn't have to hit a freighter to kill it. You only had to make it doubt the water. A new crewman asked if this counted as fighting. The ops officer didn't smile. Shipping lanes were arteries, he said. Cities ate because steel and coal and rice moved in predictable patterns. Mines turned patterns into coin flips, then into refusals, then into hunger. A few % of the command's sorties, properly placed, could strangle more tonnage than entire bombing weeks. Mac wrote the word calories in the map's corner because it nagged him to remember what the pins were really skewering. They briefed routes, weather, altitudes. The navigator's art was humility: measure twice, believe the instrument, never guess. Over the runway lights, the night was rich and soft. Mac would have called it kind if he hadn't learned the sky's indifference. He checked his talisman, a tiny slide rule polished by worry, and climbed the ladder into the greenhouse nose. The crew's jokes died into the ritual quiet that fell just before start sequence, each engine coughing and settling until the ship felt like it was made of pulse. Wheel-up left the island's warmth in a diminishing circle. Over black water he felt the shift when the aircraft became a system. Weight, distance, time. The coastline radar bloom rose like a slow sunrise. At the release point, the bombardier's voice was steady. 1, 2, 3. Metal falling to carve uncertainty into a nation's supply. Mac penciled the times, thinking absurdly of a kettle somewhere with a woman watching a thermometer. When the last mine fell, the ship felt lighter in a way the scale could not show. Shimonoseki Strait, early April 1945. Seaman Taro Nakajima rubbed rope tar into his palms until the sting quieted. The trawler had been a fishing boat before conscription. Now the Navy called her a minesweeper and told the crew to trust the sweep wire like a prayer. Dawn lay in a grey band where the strait pinched between islands. The cable thrummed as if singing to the sea's old bones. Nakajima could smell fuel he wasn't allowed to waste and the kelp that clung to everything like second skin. They cut a path and watched for the flicker that meant their gear had kissed a mine. One popped at a polite distance. A cough, a white column, a slap of shock that rattled their teeth. The petty officer shouted something that wanted to be triumph and landed short. The current ran stubborn. Another flare bobbed and dipped beyond reach. Nakajima imagined the mines waiting on the bottom, each with a temper tuned to the wrong ship at the wrong time, patient as fishing. The rumour mill aboard said freighters no longer risked certain channels. A cousin wrote that his village bartered millet for barley because rice went to soldiers first. Fishing boats, he said, were idle not for lack of sea, but for lack of fuel and courage. In port, cranes had grown less purposeful. The men on them learned a new skill called waiting. The petty officer produced a chart from a pocket and showed the patrol's box, a child's rectangle drawn over the ocean's boredom. They would run it again. When the sweep wire snagged on a current eddy, Nakajima braced and breathed tar and salt and the sour of fear. Across the strait, rails twisted from air raids made the shore look arthritic. He would have laughed earlier in the war at the idea that an enemy could close seas without ships. Now he watched the horizon as if it were a door that had decided to stay closed. The boat's little engine knocked, a sound like a man clearing his throat before telling a lie. No freighter appeared. He thought of his wife wrapping rice balls in seaweed for him on early mornings, of the exact way the salt would have dried in the corners of his mouth by noon. The memory made his stomach a fist. A cable creaked, a buoy winked. The petty officer ticked a box with a pencil worn down to cruel wood. They had cleared something, somewhere, and the ocean seemed unimpressed. Nakajima wiped his hands on his trousers and looked into the grey. The strait carried more silence than ships. Spring through summer 1945 ran like a railroad timetable in Rose Martinez's ledger. Car numbers, dock times, ice quotas, slaughterhouse stamps, each line a pulse that never skipped. The depot reefer doors exhaled cold when opened, and the Kansas noon was stitched with the neat geometry of supply: inbound beef, outbound stew, a carbon copy signature laid over yesterday's. She weighed the ladles pour on a scale calibrated, the inspector said, to within 1/10 of an ounce. 8 ounces per bowl for enemy prisoners, bread and fruit besides, coffee that tasted like morning even in afternoon. She did not say it aloud, but she understood that law had become muscle memory. In a different night, Harold McGovern rode the green glow of a radar return until a shoreline sketch emerged, and the release clock turned polite insistence into order. Mines fell at counted intervals, the bombardier's voice notched with numbers, and vanished into dark that carried them where mathematics told them to wait. Mac marked hits that were not hits at all, no flames, no blossom of ruin, just the sound, felt more than heard, of a shiplighter by the weight of a weapon it no longer carried. He had learned to love the quiet victories. The aircraft purred at a speed that made charts small, and he wrote times as if they were prayers. By June, analysts tacked up a sheet that made even the ground crews chew their pencils. A small fraction of 21st Bomber Command's sorties, the mining runs, a few in 100, had driven the majority of Japan's late-war shipping losses. The curve kinked like a broken rail. Serviceable shipping inside the home waters withered toward a remnant, roughly 12% of what had once fed the islands, while harbours that used to speak in cranes and whistles found only echo. It looked like a magician's trick until you put a spoon into the stew and remembered that calories travel or they don't. Rose overheard a guard say the Germans were eating better than he had in training and smiled into the steam. Regulations, she said when asked, with the patience of a woman explaining weather. On an airfield, half an ocean away, Mac penciled calories beside a string of coordinates because the word made him honest. The impossible statistic hummed between them, this idea that a handful of nights could starve an empire faster than months of fire, and neither knew the other existed. By August, Rose's chalk squeaked out meat for the 100th time. Over Tokyo Bay, parachutes would bloom. The same bomb bays that had sown absence were about to pour mercy, crate by crate, label by label, like a ledger closing itself with a flourish that smelled of pepper and potatoes. Tokyo in high summer wore hunger like a fever. A mother bargained a silk heirloom for a sack of barley, the shopkeeper counting with a thumb that trembled not from greed but from malnutrition. Trams ran light when they ran at all. The streets smelled of fish that hadn't arrived and coal that wouldn't come. In Omori, Red Hanlon watched a guard pick at a boil on his wrist and mutter about trains that no longer kept their promises. The rumour was always the same. Somewhere rice existed, but the rails between field and city were broken or afraid. A chaplain came to the fence and told a story that had the shape of mercy, but not the taste. Mines, he whispered. So many mines that skippers refused channels their fathers had trusted blindfolded. He was careful with numbers the way priests are careful with names, but his eyes said plenty. At night, Red listened to the harbour's new silence. Even crows had grown thin. The smell of low tide mingled with the scorched sweet scent of neighbourhoods that had burned months before and now refused to rebuild because rebuilding requires fuel and faith. Across the water, warehouses held their breath. Coal piles shrank. Fishing boats rocked without purpose because nets are useless when fuel is theory. Red learned words he'd never needed. Ration tickets, barley substitution, sweet potato vines. He remembered Kansas coffee steam and hated that the memory hurt as much as it warmed. A medic in the compound studied the prisoner's ankles for edema and warned about refeeding like a priest passing scripture. "You take it slow," he said. "The body will betray a man who gulps grace too quickly." By late August, a rumour grew legs. Allied planes had been dropping food to camps on other islands, and someone had seen parachutes over the inland sea. Red tried not to hope. Hope was a muscle that, if flexed too often without result, tore where you couldn't see. He walked the yard for the exercise calories could not supply and found himself counting pilings, then counting breaths, then counting nothing at all. Somewhere a train whistle blew as if remembering a schedule from another year. He stood still until the sound faded. When the first thrum of engines finally reached the yard, the men did not move at first. They had learned not to trust horizons. Red closed his eyes to make the sound larger. He thought of a ranger's hidden can of meat and a Kansas chalkboard that had said meat in letters tall as a promise. The wind shifted. Salt, rot, then something else, the imagined ghost of pepper, slid over the fence like a scout going first. Red opened his eyes and refused to smile, saving the muscle for when it would count. Manila, early February 1945, before dawn carried colour. The gate at Santo Tomas bent under the will of a flying column from the 1st Cavalry Division, cavalry in name, combustion and courage in fact. A half-hour later, mess tins clattered like castanets as cooks threw heat under pots raided from field kitchens. The first ladles went to people who had forgotten the word full. In the rivered south at Los Baños 3 weeks later, parachutes opened at first light and boats knifed toward shore on a clock that treated seconds like property. The water steamed with breath and effort, paddles struck rhythm, the shore gave way. These scenes would have carried on without the audience of history, but the choreography deserves the slow replay. The 11th Airborne synchronized a drop and an amphibious pickup with the exactitude of a metronome, landing sticks where the map said they must land while guerrillas held the cordon and civilians read lips that said, "We came." Radios hissed in 3 languages, watches ticked in 1. The first bites always sounded like prayer. When the rescued tasted canned meat, the eyes changed first, then the shoulders, then the voices that remembered names. Intelligence officers briefed the rescuers that the home islands were different from Luzon. Tighter, colder, and about to be squeezed at the neck by a campaign as quiet as snow. Airdropped mines seeded in straits and harbours until ships grew timid and schedules dissolved. The paratrooper would later say the strangest part was the way the Japanese guards stared at food as if it were a performance. In the moment, all he knew was the smell of fat waking muscles he had trained to ignore hunger. A guerrilla boatman crossed himself, then laughed like a man who had just heard progress speak his dialect. The column that cracked Santo Tomas cracked a myth too, that distance and water would protect the enemy's civilians from the arithmetic of war. The rescues were costly in planning and light in casualties by the grace of tempo. The doctrine of the day said speed saves more lives than armour when surprise is on your side. The men moved as if they trusted paperwork, and for good reason. Somebody had staged rations, fuel, medical kits, boats and maps with a clerk's genius. In a notebook, the paratrooper later wrote 3 words that felt bigger than his handwriting. Get them fed. He tucked the notebook away and helped a boy hold a bowl without spilling. The boy's hands shook until the stew steadied them. Above the roofs, a single parachute caught on a chimney and snapped in the breeze like a flag trying out its voice. The clock kept time, the boats nosed back into the current, the column rolled, and the city for an hour remembered how to breathe. Guam again, late summer 1945, the kind of heat that makes men talk in half sentences. In the debriefing hut, a clerk tacked up a chart that turned the room quiet. Harold McGovern lifted his chin and read the slope as if it were a sermon. A few percent of 21 Bomber Command's missions, the mining sorties he had flown at night until the sky felt like a narrow hallway, had generated the lion's share of Japan's late-war shipping losses. The numbers carried their own grammar. More than 12,000 mines seeded into straits and harbours. Hundreds of ships sunk or lamed. Port traffic curves that fell like a stairwell with missing steps. He traced a finger along the Shimonoseki Strait, then Tokyo Bay, then the inlets whose names he knew only by the way their radar ghosts rose like bruises. Radar altimeter steady at the drop height. Release intervals counted against ground speed. The crew's banter reduced to clipped acknowledgements. Mark, release, off. He could feel the aircraft lighten one small notch at a time as cases slipped free. It would have looked like boredom from a distance. It was victory acquired wholesale. The ops officer used the word paralysis, and no one laughed. Recon stills showed harbours that looked like Sundays. Cranes were present tense, loads past tense. In the intel annex, a civilian analyst with a coffee he never finished sketched a supply chain like a vascular diagram and penciled in blockages as if they were clots. Coal moved slowly, fertilizer hardly at all, fish not enough to matter. He drew an arrow to a city's name and wrote a simple wound, fewer than 1,700 calories per person by summer. That line, more than any photograph, made the room taste metallic. Mac wrote calories beside his own coordinates again because the habit had become superstition. A boy navigator in the back hummed a church tune under his breath and then stopped, embarrassed or grateful. Someone joked that if you measured American output by hours, a single shift in a stateside plant could move more protein than a whole coastal convoy dared by August. No one checked the math out loud. They didn't have to. The map showed the truth in silence. He walked out into heat that smelled of hot cordite and spilled aviation fuel. On the runway, crews wiped oil from nacelles with motions practiced into prayer. The Pacific lay beyond with its miles and its assurance that miles meant less now than will. Mac touched the nose of his superfortress like a farmer patting the flank of a good horse, and felt only gratitude to a machine that made arithmetic into mercy. Tokyo Bay brightened like polished tin, and the parachutes came again as if the sky had learned generosity. Operation Swift Mercy did not announce itself with trumpets. It thunked into yards and school fields and prison compounds with the workaday rhythm of logistics doing its job. Red watched crates kiss dust and slide, medics jogging toward impact, detail parties moving with the loose efficiency of men who know food is both medicine and morale. The stencils on the boxes said enough. The smell finished the sentence. Beef, milk powder, chocolate, coffee. Doctors warned with a liturgy they had repeated on too many islands. Slow, small portions, electrolytes before indulgence. Red nodded and did what soldiers do when someone with a clipboard and a kind face gives an order that sounds like love. He obeyed. The first spoonful hovered, cooled, anointed the tongue. He had expected tears and found instead a calm so profound it frightened him. The body recognized salt and fat like an old friend at the door. Around him, the yard turned from a place of sentences to a place of beginnings. On airfields, the length of parades, crews had strapped these bundles into the same bomb bays that had sown influence mines months earlier. B-17S and B-29s that had memorized the run-out from takeoff to coast in now memorized the weight of mercy. Pilots flew low and careful. Navigators marked drops with the same quiet tally they had used for war. Somebody had rearranged the cargo of a nation because the war was over and because law said the enemy's prisoners came first. A cook somewhere stateside was still writing meat on a chalkboard. The handwriting reached across the ocean. The young Japanese guard blinked at Red's spoon when it tipped his way. He hesitated, glanced left, made the smallest bow a man can make without calling it that, and tasted what had humiliated his empire more than any speech could. The reliable taste of American logistics, salted and peppered and parcelled in tins. Far above, another parachute opened. The silk cracked like a handheld flag. The harbour took on a new sound. Wood creak, can clatter, fork scrape, a music of arrival after a year of abstinence. Red didn't know the term serviceable steel tonnage or the curves pinned in Guam. He knew only that the stew had potatoes. He knew that debris in his lungs loosened when he laughed. He knew that a spoon could be an armistice if a man offered it with his eyes open. Stateside, the depot looked like a cathedral to repetition. Rose walked a catwalk above aisles of crates stacked 20 feet high, the labels neat as hymnals. Flour, sugar, beef, coffee. She could taste the diesel in the air the way a sailor tastes weather. The war had flipped a switch, and the factory country that came awake in 1942 had not yet learned to sleep. Refrigerated cars still queued like obedient cattle. Clerks still clicked abacuses and called it progress. The Quartermaster Corps filed regulations like scripture and then proved them with schedules. Post-surrender changed the nouns quicker than it changed the verbs. Relief supplanted resupply, but the rails did not care what word the paper used. Rose rode a switching engine to the cold room and watched carcasses swing on hooks in a metallic breeze so steady it felt like doctrine. Trains went out with food labelled for nations that had recently hated the senders. She kept a ledger because ledgers tell truth even when speeches do not. She learned to recognize the shape weight makes on a man's shoulders when he carries it correctly. A letter from a liberated POW reached her cot, the paper as thin as hospital sheets. He wrote that stew tasted like a promise kept. The next envelope wore a gold star and the kindest handwriting she had ever seen. She read both twice and set them side by side, victory and cost sharing a nightstand. The band from town practiced again, but the brass sounded different now, as if the instruments knew where their metal had been requisitioned from and paused to consider. In the mess, a German prisoner said thank you with the careful vowels of a man learning a new country by taste. At inspection, a major quizzed her on portion control and smiled when her answers landed like rounds on target. He spoke quietly about prisoner mortality rates she didn't need to memorize to understand, about the law being a lifeline, about the rightness of feeding men who had been enemies yesterday. She nodded because nodding was what you did when the truth matched the work. Outside, a reefer door sighed, and the fog of cold rolled like a tide over boots and pallet jacks. She stood in it longer than necessary, letting the chill write its own amen across her forearms. She closed her ledger and wrote one word in the margin where she would see it when the ink had dried. Proof. The nation had demonstrated line by line and car by car that abundance could be a weapon more permanent than blast. Somewhere, parachutes were folding themselves for storage. Somewhere else, a ship's bell rang twice. The depot lights clicked off in sequence, a benediction in fluorescent cadence. The building kept its own heartbeat after midnight, and Rose, listening, believed she could count it without error. Tokyo Bay breathed in fog on the 2nd of September 1945, while fountain pens scratched aboard a battleship and men with ribbons read words that closed a chapter. On shore, a dented tin clicked against a stove and sent up the smell that had become Victory's signature. Pepper, potatoes, beef. Red sat on a crate because he could sit on a crate now, lungs working without wheeze, and tried to let the air be ordinary. He thought of the fence he had learned by touch, of pilings counted, of breaths measured because hunger had made arithmetic a religion. Harold McGovern stood on a tarmac far away and read a consolidated report whose fonts looked too calm for what they contained. Mines laid since March, more than 12,000. Ships sunk or lamed in numbers that once would have belonged only to fantasies. Serviceable tonnage in the home waters by August, a sliver of the fleet that had set out in 1941. Port traffic curves broken like bones that would knit only with peace. The line that seemed a trick of axes told a plain story. A few % of mining sorties had starved a nation's movement, and then the same bomb bays fed its prisoners. Taro Nakajima folded a letter he had not finished and watched a harbour that had remembered how to move. Tug whistles argued like old friends. A freighter's wake wrinkled the surface with the bravado of a returnee. He thought of the sweep wire singing in April, of fuel measured in apologies, of the day the horizon had been an answer shaped like nothing. He did not have the language to bless an enemy's mercy, so he bowed to the water and let it choose his words. Rose Martinez poured coffee into mugs that had seen training camps, prisoner lines, and now parades. She had learned that throughputs could be kindness when pointed correctly. She had also learned that ledgers can eulogize without saying so. The band down the block struck a march and turned it, without seeming to try, into a hymn. Historians would call it sea denial, and air mining and humanitarian airlift, would footnote civilian calories and POW survival rates, would argue over margins and models. Veterans would remember crows on pilings, chalkboards promising meat, the creak of a crate sliding over dust. The impossible numbers would remain impossible and therefore persuasive. Red lifted his spoon and passed it to a young guard who had become, over the course of one bite, a man he could imagine forgiving. The sky smelled of rain, and the harbour at last smelled of work.